Good day to everyone. I'm Murray Urowitz, the rheumatologist at the University of Toronto, the founder of the University of Toronto Lupus Clinic, and its director of the lupus program until last June. And I'm delighted to speak to you today on the topic of, has the bimodal mortality pattern in SLE evolved in recent years? This is actually a fascinating topic because in one lifetime, we can see the description of a very important comorbidity in lupus, how it's investigated, how treatment has changed over time, and to look at the success of that treatment and the modification of this comorbidity. So let's look at this very interesting development. It all really began in 1976 with the first report of the bimodal mortality pattern in systemic lupus. And what was described at that time was that people with lupus who die early die of their disease, either active lupus or its treatment, especially infection. But if they lived a significant period of time, one of the important causes of death happened to be coronary artery disease. Now, coronary artery disease in women is very unusual. So when this was first reported, I must admit there was a lot of skepticism as to this finding, but eventually it became clear that this was an important comorbidity and that it occurred anywhere between 6% of every population up to 17%. But more important, if you compared the prevalence of coronary artery disease in lupus patients versus their age and sex-matched controls, lupus patients had up to 50-fold increase in the prevalence of coronary artery disease. So it became a very important comorbidity. And not only that, of course, coronary artery disease is associated with increased mortality. And so it was an important clinical feature and also an important cause of mortality. So if you saw your patients early in their disease in the first 6-8 years, the prevalence of coronary disease was low by 5 or 6%, and you might not even have detected it. But as you follow these patients into their second and third and fourth decades, the prevalence goes up dramatically, so that when a woman reaches her 60s in lupus, about 1 in 5 will have had a myocardial infarction or angina or a stent placement, etc. Now, when you're talking about that amount of coronary artery disease in women, that's distinctly abnormal. So this was clearly an important and prevalent comorbidity. Not only was it an important clinical comorbidity, it was also an important cause of death. So when we looked at our patients for mortality, when there were about 206 patients in our cohort who had died, and you looked at the causes of death, well, lupus was the cause of death in about 19% of our patients. But in 21.5%, more than in lupus, the cause of death was an atherosclerotic event, a coronary artery disease event usually. So it became an important clinical comorbidity and an important cause of mortality as well. So what do we do about this? So over the next number of years after this initial discovery, it was clear that we needed to detect this comorbidity before it presented, before they needed coronary artery bypass. So we had to look for subclinical disease. And as we looked for subclinical disease, we found some other very interesting things of even preclinical disease. So let me describe what I mean by that. In terms of subclinical disease, 3 different methods were used to discover subclinical disease, much like they are used in the general population, looking for atherosclerotic disease. So first there was looking at the carotid artery for intimal medial thickening or carotid artery plaque area. So if you found those thickening of the carotid artery, or more important, if you found carotid artery plaque, the prevalence of atherosclerotic disease was increased dramatically. As a matter of fact, if you were found to have plaque, your incidence of atherosclerotic disease was increased tenfold. And that plaque was also associated with some of the risk factors, high LDL and low HDL. So that looking at the carotid artery with intermedial thickening and plaque formation was probably the first approach to try to diagnose something early. The second approach was to do myocardial perfusion studies. So if you perfuse the heart with radioactive isotopes such as thallium and technetium, and then you measure, and then you do an arterial stimulant to cause vasodilation, such as a treadmill associated test, or to do a chemical vasodilator such as dipyrimidol, you could then evaluate whether the coronary arteries could dilate to accommodate stress. So that's a common method used by cardiologists to detect coronary artery disease. Well, we did that in our patients with systemic lupus. We perfused them with radioactive isotopes, used that dipyrimidol stress, and in 117 patients that we did who had no history of coronary artery disease at all, 35% of them had abnormal perfusion. So these people had no symptoms, no hint of coronary artery disease, but already a third of them had dramatic coronary artery disease. So that was very instructive for us. The final way of looking is a method, a very interesting method called brachial artery flow mediated dilatation. So in this test, what you do is you put a blood pressure cuff on the arm, you blow it up over 200 and leave it that way for 4 to 5 minutes. And then you release the cuff. And as you release the cuff, blood shoots forward into the brachial artery, and you can actually measure with an ultrasound transducer how much dilatation occurs in that brachial artery, right? So can the brachial artery distend to accommodate this flush of blood? And the amount of distensibility in the brachial artery is very closely correlated to the amount of distensibility in coronary arteries. So if there is obstruction in the brachial artery, you can assume that there is some similar destruction in the coronary arteries and therefore compromising myocardial function. So we did this test, the flow-mediated test, in 92 of our patients, and we found that 23% of them who had no history of coronary disease at all, nothing to suspect underlying disease, 23% of them had abnormal flow-mediated dilatation. So what did we find? Subclinically, some patients had coronary artery block. In the perfusion studies, a third of them were abnormal, even when they had no symptoms at all. And with the flow-mediated dilatation, over a fifth of them, 23%, had abnormal tests. So the amount of subclinical disease was dramatic. And that really told us, look, we've got to address this at the subclinical level, not wait until they get a heart attack, but treat when we have these abnormal subclinical tests that we do for patients with presumed heart disease. So the clinical event is just the tip of the iceberg. All of that underneath, 20, 30% of people with abnormal scanning and dilatation studies, they have to be looked after as well. Well, that's a subclinical disease. And then we had this most astounding finding. This all came about because of studies we were doing with the SLIC cohort. The SLIC cohort is that's Systemic Lupus International Collaborating Clinics. These are 43 clinics, multinational, from all around the world, who are studying lupus. And one of the subjects they were studying was atherosclerotic disease and lupus. So we were following the patients in that cohort looking for atherosclerotic disease, and we found the most astounding thing. We found the atherosclerotic disease as we expected in a significant number, but we found 16 instances where the atherosclerotic disease, the myocardial infarction, occurred 6 years before the diagnosis of lupus. So this wasn't subclinical, this was preclinical. They didn't even have lupus yet, and they presented to their doctors with coronary artery disease. What did that mean? Did that mean that we were missing their lupus, that they had subclinical lupus and people didn't realize it and they got the heart disease? Or does it mean that lupus and heart disease run concurrently as two separate streams, perhaps differently genetically determined? And in most patients, the atherosclerosis occurs after the lupus, but in a small number, it occurs before the lupus. Now, this is so important, really, that the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association said, if a woman presents to you, cardiologist, if a woman presents to you in her 50s or 40s or early 60s with a heart attack, you investigate her for a connective tissue disease like lupus, right? Because in lupus, you can get a heart attack earlier before even the diagnosis of lupus. So now we have subclinical disease and even preclinical disease. Now, when you're talking about preclinical disease, the next thing that happened was really quite interesting. In 2017, the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology said, you know, our diagnosis of hypertension, 140/90 or more, is not correct. That's too high. People are getting heart attacks even when it's lower than that. We've got to lower our suggested diagnosis for normal tension, for normal blood pressure, to 130/80. Now, all the years we have been using is 140/90. So if you're 140/90, you're fine. Now, in 2017 onwards, no, that's not fine. We have to strive for 130/80 and not 140/90. So to see what the implication of that is, we took all of our patients and we said, okay, wait a minute. Let's see how many of our patients were normotensive by our definition. That is 140/90. Then let's look at how many of our patients were between 130 and 140, or 80 and 90. It's just a little bit lower. How many of our patients were that, which is the new definition for hypertension? And then how many people were normotensive, that is less than 130/80? So we looked at those people and we wanted to see, was there a difference in the three groups? The old diagnosis of hypertension, the new diagnosis of hypertension, and normotension by the new definition, 130/80. Well, our patients who were 140/90, over time, there were 21% who had an atherosclerotic event. In the new definition, that is, they were between 130 and 140, or between 80 and 90, 13% had an atherosclerotic event. And in those people who are clearly normotensives now, at below 130/80, only 4.8% had an event. So with the old definition, a larger number of events. With the new definition, less than 140/80, but still high. And only at 130/80 did we get a lower level of 4.8. So here's another preclinical or subclinical. People are walking around with what we thought was normal blood pressure, and they were having increased events. So we had to readjust our thinking to now say, oh no, if you're not 130/80, you got to be treated, because your chance of getting a heart attack are higher than if your blood pressure was below 130/80. All right, so you see, we've now got subclinical, preclinical. These are all the things that the doctors needed to do now. Not only treat your lupus, but investigate them for this very prevalent comorbidity and treat it appropriately. All right, so what's happened? Well, let me tell you what really triggered this whole new look. In that SLIC cohort I told you about, this is a cohort started in the year 2000, so in the modern era. And we've been following when they develop their atherosclerotic events, when they develop heart attacks, etc. And what we found that at the end of 10 years, we wanted the first decade of their life, we found that there were 4.4% had an atherosclerotic event. 4%. When I saw that, I said, there's a problem here. That's 4%. We were expecting, after 8 or 9 years from our studies and everybody else's studies, that it would be somewhere between 8 and 13%, 10 or 11% for sure. And here it was 4.8%. How could that be? What's happened? So we said, we've got to check this out. So the way we could check it out, our cohort has been followed now since 1970. So we said, let's look at the patients in our cohort in the old era, before 2000. And then let's look at our patients after 2000, so they'd be similar to the SLIC patients, and see if there is, in fact, a difference. Is this a real difference? Well, it's very interesting. When we took our patients seen between 75 and 87, the old era, imagine calling that the ancient times, we found that there were 11% of our patients had an atherosclerotic event. That's exactly what we had reported in the past and what we're finding as we review the data today. Remember, that was the older era prior to the SLIC study. In our new era, in the Toronto cohort, that is from 1999 to 2011, and then followed for 7 years after that, the prevalence was 3.8%, not 11%, 3.8, which was very close to what the SLIC cohort was, which is in the modern era. Remember, I told you that the SLIC cohort was about 4%, and this is 3.8%. And that's very different from the old era, which was 11%. So something has happened. In the modern times, the prevalence of coronary artery disease has decreased threefold. Why did that happen? Did that happen because we diagnosed people earlier? Or did it happen because we were treating the risk factors for atherosclerosis more aggressively? So that got us to look at the risk factors. And I want to just summarize and show you how we've come full tilt now in this story. We examined how we treated and how successful we were in treating the risk factors for coronary disease in the old patients between 1975 and 1994, and the new patients between 1999 and 2017. Okay, so what's happened? Let's look at the classic risk factors. Well, the number of years with a normal blood pressure, percent of years with normal blood pressure in their follow-up in the old cohort was 72%. 72% had normal blood pressure. In the modern era, 88.7%. Why? We're diagnosing hypertension differently, and we have much better drugs to treat hypertension. So hypertension is much better treated. What about cholesterol? The percent of time that our patients had a normal cholesterol. Well, in the old cohort, in what I call the ancient times, 39.7% had a normal cholesterol in their follow-up. 39%. There weren't a lot of drugs for cholesterol, and people weren't as attuned to testing for it in the 70s and 80s. In the modern time, 72%. So 39 versus 72. Much better treatment for cholesterol. What about glucose treatment, another predisposing factor for atherosclerosis? So in the old era, most people, 84%, had a normal blood sugar. But in the modern era, with new treatments and earlier treatments for high blood sugar, 93%. 82 versus 93, much better control. And finally, smoking. Whoa, that terrible habit that people have. And even today, we can't break that habit. But in the old cohort, the number of years, the percent of the people who smoked was 24.7, 25%, say. In the modern era, thank goodness, only 11%. So what I've showed you is that for blood pressure, cholesterol, blood glucose, smoking, all the traditional risk factors are much better controlled at the present time than they were in ancient times, in the 70s and the 80s. The other very interesting thing is, if you look at how we've been able to control the disease, we can look at that using adjusted mean SLE day, a measure of disease activity. In the first 5 years, the worst years of lupus disease, in the first 5 years, the amount of disease in the first 5 years in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was significantly higher than it is now. In other words, what we're doing is we're getting the disease under control earlier. So not only are we treating the risk factors, we're also treating the lupus itself, which is a risk factor. The inflammation of lupus itself may be a risk factor for atherosclerosis. So that's the good news story. We, first of all, were able to describe this comorbidity, this atherosclerotic comorbidity. We then were able to show that it existed even before it presented itself clinically, and in some cases even existed preclinical, before the diagnosis of lupus. We've adjusted to the new blood pressure measures that we have to achieve. And with all of those things, I've shown you that we have made dramatic progress in treating the risk factors and treating the lupus. And that is the explanation as to why atherosclerotic disease has been decreased threefold at least from the 70s and 80s. So it's not gone yet. We're still talking about 3% of our patients who will develop it, but it's not 11 and 12%. So we have to work a little bit harder to get those 3% down to even lower, but we've made dramatic progress in one lifetime since the first description of the bimodal mortality pattern. Thank you very much.